WorkSafe BC Provider Portal Training Series, Invoicing. In this session, we'll discuss when you can submit an invoice through the portal for either referrals or cases, and then through a walkthrough in the portal, we'll talk about the invoicing lifecycle, how to create and submit an invoice, how to access invoices that are a work in progress, and the associated work lists. We're going to do a very quick review of the referral lifecycle. So a new referral will arrive in the portal with a status of new. You must acknowledge it before the expiration period. And then after you've acknowledged it, you need to determine whether you will accept it or decline it. If you accept the referral, it is from this point forward that you can submit clinical reporting or invoicing. And even after a referral transitions to a case, as you can see in the life cycle diagram, your ability to submit clinical reporting or invoicing persists through to the end of the life cycle. The process for submitting an invoice through the portal is identical for referrals and cases. In both situations, you must open to view the details, and then using the action panel on the right-hand side, click the Create Invoice button to begin the process. The very first screen you see is the Create Invoice screen. At this point, no invoice has been created. At the top of the screen, you see the referral header. So the first step in the process is to confirm that you have the correct worker, the correct claim number, and the correct program for which you intend to submit an invoice. Directly below is the Provider Information panel, which we need to expand in order to view. The next step is to confirm the provider information that will be associated to the invoice. At the top, we see the provider organization name and associated CPR ID. Directly below that will be the clinic location information. On the right-hand side, we see the Pay-To name and address. This is coming from CMS. And directly below that is the billing payee number. It is important that the billing payee number and the Pay-To name and address are correct before you proceed with invoicing. Also in the Provider Information panel is a field for contract number. At this time, this field is empty. We'll come back to this in a moment. We now move on to the invoice header, which requires two key pieces of information: the invoice number and the invoice date. An invoice cannot be created without entering these two fields. For invoice number, any combination of alphanumeric characters will be accepted. However, the invoice number must be unique to the provider organization. This means that two clinic locations cannot be submitting an invoice with the same invoice number. It must be unique across the entire organization. When selecting the invoice date, you cannot select a day that is after the current date. This means you cannot post-date an invoice. Before you create the invoice, it is important to confirm that the invoice number and invoice date are correct as entered. Once the invoice has been created, these two fields cannot be modified. If they need to be changed, you will need to delete the invoice and start again. The invoice has now been saved. This means that it is now a work in progress and will be accessible from the Draft Invoices work list. At the top, we can see the invoice header with the invoice number and invoice date displayed, but neither of which can be modified. If we go back to the Provider Information panel, we see the contract number now displays. It is the invoice date that determines which contract is in effect for this invoice. You can only invoice in the context of one contract. If you have a worker whose service dates span more than one contract, you must submit separate invoices for the service dates that fall within each of the contracts. We're now ready to enter line items on the invoice using the Line Item Entry panel. The first field to be completed is the date of service. It is the date of service that will determine which fee schedule is in effect for this line item. Therefore, it is important that you complete the fields in the order in which they're presented on screen. Note that the service date must be on or before the invoice date. As soon as the date of service is entered, the portal will load all effective fee code schedules. Once loaded, you can select a fee code. Use the symbol to select a fee code that is contracted for the program. When you select a contracted fee code, the portal will pre-populate the price field. For some fee codes, this is a fixed amount and it cannot be changed. For other fee codes, there is an applicable range with minimum and maximum amounts that are allowed. You must understand from your contract how much you should enter. You can manually change this, but the portal will not be able to tell you if the amount you've entered is correct or not. It will, however, prevent you from entering an amount that is less than the minimum or greater than the maximum allowable within the range. For the purpose of this walkthrough, we do not need to change the price, but we do need to enter the number of units. Again, it is your contract that will determine what you need to enter for number of units. Therefore, you must have familiarity with your contract to know what to enter here. The portal cannot determine this for you. The last two fields are for applicable taxes. Taxes are applied per line item. Due to the high degree of variance, the portal does not do any calculations or validation of the tax amounts entered. You must calculate these and validate them offline and then enter the amount in the portal. In this example, we will not enter anything for taxes, and we're ready to add the line item to the invoice. When you click the Add Row button, the invoice will be saved and the new line item will be added to the display panel at the top. We're now ready to enter our next line item. Notice that as new line items are added, the associated totals recalculate. For this next example, we're going to add a non-contracted fee code to the same invoice. This may come up for some programs, in particular for miscellaneous expenses. What you can add as a non-contracted fee code will be governed by the practices and procedures outlined by WorkSafe BC. To add a non-contracted fee code, use the lookup functionality of the fee code field. You can enter a numerical value or a text description. It may return more than one matching result. You must know exactly which fee code you're supposed to use, as the portal cannot distinguish this for you. Unlike contracted fee codes, when you use a non-contracted fee code, the price field will not auto-populate. Therefore, in addition to the number of units, you must know exactly what price you're supposed to enter. The portal cannot determine this for you. We have now completed all of the line entries for the invoice. As a final step before we submit the invoice, we want to verify that the information that we've entered is correct and accurate. Once an invoice has been submitted to WorkSafe BC through the portal, it cannot be retracted or voided or modified through the portal. If you are invoicing for fee codes that have an associated proof requirement, for example the submission of a report, then ensure that that proof has been submitted and received by WorkSafe BC before you submit your invoicing. We have now verified all the information entered on the invoice and confirmed that any proof requirements have been met. We're now ready to submit the invoice. Once you click the Submit Invoice button, you are presented with a dialog to confirm the submission. If you click No, you can cancel the submission. If you click Submit Invoice at this point, the invoice will be submitted and you cannot retract it at that point. If the submission was successful, you will see the Submitted Invoice screen. It looks very similar to the previous, except this is read-only and it can no longer be modified. When you submit your invoice, the portal will create a PDF representation of the invoice. This is accessible from a link at the top of the screen. The PDF will open in its own window, and you can use your browser's built-in functionality to either print it or save it to your file system. If you want to create a new invoice, your starting point will always be either the referral work lists under the Referrals tab or the Cases work lists under the Cases tab. You must always be in the context of a referral or a case in order to create a new invoice. However, once the invoice has been created, then your starting point will always be the Invoices tab. The View Invoice link will take you to the invoicing work lists. There are two work lists associated with invoices: drafts, or your work in progress, and submitted invoices. Both of these work lists will only show invoices that have been created or submitted through the portal. They will not display non-portal invoicing. As with referrals and case work lists, the invoicing work lists also have the filters so that you can locate invoices quickly. For our next walkthrough, we're going to start with an invoice that has already been created and is a work in progress. So our starting point is the Draft Invoices work list. As you can see, when you open up an invoice that is a work in progress, you can continue to add new line items as well as remove line items. You cannot, however, change the invoice number or the invoice date. We've determined that we need to add an additional line item to the invoice. We've just received an error. This is because the service date that we selected is later than the invoice date. As we mentioned earlier, the service date must be on or before the invoice date. Just to reiterate, whenever you add or remove a line item from an invoice, the invoice is automatically saved. The last saved date and time is displayed at the top of the screen. Once a line item has been added to an invoice, it cannot be modified. However, you can delete it and re-enter it correctly. In this scenario, we've determined we have a line item on the invoice that is not required, so we just want to delete it. I've finished working with this invoice for now, and in closing we'll talk about the three links at the bottom of the screen. The first is the Submit Invoice button, which we demonstrated in the first walkthrough. This will submit the invoice to WorkSafe BC. The second is the Close link. This will maintain the invoice as a work in progress and will return me to the invoicing work lists. The third link is the Delete Invoice link. If I click this, I will permanently delete the invoice from the portal. I would do this if it was no longer required and I had no need to submit it to WorkSafe BC. Once an invoice is deleted, it cannot be retrieved, and only invoices that are a work in progress can be deleted. This concludes the training session for invoicing.